Hello, welcome back to my kitchen. Today we are talking about leftovers. I like to call leftovers bonus meals because when we're talking about eating more at home and cooking more at home, leftovers are so helpful to save you time, save you money, make the use of cooking once and then you get to enjoy that for several times. However, there are a couple of tricks to using leftovers, knowing which ones are going to store better, knowing how to store them, how long to store them, and also what to do with them once you are ready to eat them. How do you reheat them? How do you get the most out of them? Like some recipes, if they were crispy to begin with, you're going to need to reheat them in a different way than others. And then another way to use leftovers is to repurpose them. So I'm excited to give you a few tips today. If you have any specific questions, I'd love if you dropped a comment and I will try to answer any specifics because this is a super broad topic. But I'm going to first start off with storage. So there are some recipes that tend to lend themselves better to leftovers and some that do not. A really easy way to differentiate these is that ones that are good for storing a long time are ones that you're already cooking for a really long time. So think casseroles or soup, things that you like to simmer and are going to blend the flavors better. Even some salads like kale that you've put the dressing on, the dressing is actually going to help the kale to be a little bit softer when you eat it the next day. So that lends itself really well, compared to things that maybe have multiple textures. So those are probably the worst things to keep as leftovers. Things like my chicken strips here. These are supposed to be tender and juicy on the inside and nice and crispy on the outside. So they're something that are not gonna be as good as leftover and we're gonna have to reheat them in a different way than others. Other things that have like a crispy texture, like salad, you would not, with lettuce instead of kale, you would not wanna put the dressing on beforehand because it's going to be even more soggy. So I have some leftover salad. I know it looks like we haven't eaten any, we had so much lettuce, but this is something that you would not want to put the dressing on because the dressing is going to make the salad more soggy and that's not what you're going to want. So that's an example of something with multiple textures where you don't want to use that as a leftover. So when you're storing it, I always recommend, if you're putting it in the freezer, to label it with what it is and with what the date is that you put it in the freezer. So I like to keep masking tape and a magic marker in my drawer. So when you're putting things away, you automatically label them. I don't know how many times, and maybe anybody else can relate, if you've put something in the freezer thinking for sure you would remember what it was, and then like, can anybody tell what this is? Like, absolutely not. So I only know that it's pulled pork because that's what it says on my label. So super easy and so much easier in the future. Okay, so number 2 with leftovers is the important thing is to know how to reheat them. So of course we're thinking like the microwave, which works really well for things like soup. Like I have my giant bowl of soup here, or you can of course put it in a pot and just reheat it on the stove. But it gets a little more important to pay attention to how you're reheating it if you have those foods with multiple textures. So think leftover French fries, which are generally the worst, or these chicken strips. These are not going to reheat very well in the microwave, so I would recommend to heat them with a heat source that's dry. So like the oven, a skillet would work really well. I had a friend recommend an air fryer, which I'm not fancy enough to have, but I have a lot of friends and also clients who love air fryers, which is heating foods that need a crispier texture on the outside with a dry heat. So that's going to be way better. So number 3, a good way to use leftovers is to repurpose them. So what I mean by repurpose is to change it into a whole new food, something that your family won't even recognize as a leftover. A great example of this is like my pulled pork here that I had in my Tupperware. When I made this, we just served it as is, but I can reheat this as leftovers and then serve it in tacos or on a salad and use it in some different ways. So a really good trick for doing this is to literally just take your leftover and wrap it up in a tortilla, and then it's all of a sudden another food. So you could do that with something like black bean skillet, or even again some of your casseroles. another really good thing to do is to do a stir fry. So if you have leftover vegetables that again need some crispiness and you don't want them just to be mushy, you could put them in a skillet at high heat. I like to saute with some cooked noodles or cooked rice, and then you have a really easy stir fry. So that's a great way to use to kind of rethink and totally repurpose your leftovers. When you are storing leftovers, the most important thing to do is to cool them down quickly. This is really hard if you have like a giant dish like this soup. You don't want to put, if this is hot coming off the stove, you'll want to let it cool down a little bit and before you put it in the refrigerator. You never want to put a hot dish directly into the freezer because it can freeze on the outside before the center cools down, and it can cause an increased risk of foodborne illness. So really important to try to cool this as quickly as you can. Spread it into multiple dishes if you need to, and put it in the fridge before you put it in the freezer. Typically, cooked food will last in the refrigerator several days. 3 days is technically the food safe length of time. However, most food will stay good for 5 days, even up to a week, but you'll lose a lot of quality. Always pay attention to what your food looks like, what it smells like. If it looks weird, if you think it's slimy, throw it away. It's not good and it's not worth it. But otherwise, food will stay good for several days. You're just losing a little bit of quality. In the freezer, food will last for up to several months. And the key for keeping things fresh is to minimize it. There's several things. So one is the amount of oxygen that it's exposed to, the amount of air, and then the temperature. So that's why frozen food is going to keep longer than food in the refrigerator because it's at a colder temperature. But also, the more you can remove any air from whatever container you're putting it in, the better it's going to be, and the better quality it's going to have. So again, if you have any specific questions about leftovers, this goes, all across the board, but they can be such a good way to incorporate a little bit of cooking, help it go a really long way, and give you some easy ways to incorporate better food into your diet. So thanks everybody for joining me. I appreciate you being here, and we'll catch you next week. Take care.